Good day, everyone. This is Larry C. Johnson. Today, I want to step back from the noise, the slogans, and the propaganda, and look calmly at where the war in Ukraine really stands, not as Washington, Brussels, or Kyiv would like to imagine it, but as it actually is. We will look at what the diplomats are saying, what the media is selling, and then compare all of that to the hard facts emerging from the battlefield. What I want to show you is that there is a striking contrast between a very confused and chaotic diplomatic process on the one hand, and a very clear, increasingly one-sided military reality on the other. Western governments and commentators talk endlessly about plans, points, and peace frameworks, but they refuse to confront the basic question that really matters. Who is winning, who is losing, and what does that mean for the future of Ukraine and for Russia's position in the world? With that in mind, let me begin by laying out why the diplomatic picture looks so convoluted and why the situation on the ground in Ukraine is, in fact, brutally simple. The diplomatic picture surrounding the war in Ukraine has rarely looked more confused, while the military reality on the ground has rarely been clearer. Western media, politicians in Brussels and Washington, and the Kyiv leadership obsess over plans, communiques, talking points, and who met whom in Geneva, Anchorage, or Abu Dhabi. They argue over 28-point plans, 19-point revisions, and leaked drafts. But they almost never confront the one fact that matters. Ukraine is losing this war badly, and if present trends continue, it is on a trajectory toward outright military collapse. Until that basic reality is acknowledged, the diplomatic maneuvers will remain incoherent and self-defeating, and all the talk of victory and strategic patience will be little more than fantasy. The latest Geneva meeting between European, Ukrainian, and American officials illustrates this disconnect. The U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, tried to sell it as a breakthrough. He told the press that enormous progress had been made, that Kyiv agreed with the core elements of Washington's plan, and that negotiations with Moscow were proceeding smoothly. The more details that emerge, the clearer it becomes that this was spin bordering on fiction. In Geneva, Ukrainian representatives reportedly made three hard lines explicit. First, they refused to amend their constitution, which commits Ukraine to joining NATO. Kyiv insists it must eventually become a NATO member, and the Europeans back this position. Second, Ukraine refuses any meaningful limitation on the size of its armed forces. Third, and most critically, it refuses to accept any territorial concessions to Russia, no recognition of Russian control over Donbass, Crimea, or any other territory. Even de facto, these positions are utterly disconnected from the battlefield. Back in April 2022, during the Istanbul talks, Russia proposed that Ukraine maintain an army capped at 85,000 men. Kyiv countered with 250,000, essentially the size of its regular forces before the special military operation, not counting hundreds of thousands of reservists. No final agreement was reached, but at least there was a serious discussion and an implicit recognition that Ukraine could not sustain a limitless force. Today, there are claims mostly floated by European or Ukrainian officials that Kyiv needs and supposedly has armed forces of 800,000 men, which far exceeds even Washington's own 28-point draft figure of 600,000. That number is absurd. Ukraine does not have the demographic or economic base to maintain such a force without permanent funding and logistical support from the West. It is also wildly out of line with the actual effective manpower Kiev can field at the front. If you look at the indicators that matter, a very different picture emerges. Ukrainian sources themselves have suggested that Kyiv recruits or re-enlists roughly 17,000 men per month, while losing around 30,000 inches casualties. If that ratio is anywhere close to accurate, Ukraine's army is shrinking by 10,000 to 15,000 men a month. Some of the most famous formations, like the 47th Mechanized Brigade, once described as Ukraine's fire brigade during the 2024 fighting, have essentially vanished from the map. The last time we heard about elements of that brigade was when it was rushed to plug holes in the Sumy region. Since then, silence. Russian officials now claim that Ukraine is losing roughly a brigade's worth of manpower every week. While those exact figures cannot be independently verified, they align disturbingly well with what we can observe. Exhausted units, fewer and fewer cohesive brigades, and an increasingly desperate mobilization. In other words, Kyiv's real fighting force today is probably in the range of 200,000 men at most, and perhaps less. Yet Ukrainian negotiators still posture about an 800,000 strong army and refuse to accept any caps at all. They resist force reductions even as their manpower pool is visibly degrading. At the same time, they insist that they will not withdraw from Donbass and will never accept any form of Russian control over Donbass, Crimea, or other territories, no matter what happens on the battlefield. This is not a negotiating stance. It is a recipe for national disaster. Against this background, Moscow's position is remarkably straightforward. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently held a press conference in Minsk alongside his Belarusian counterpart, where he was asked directly about Trump's peace plan and the possibility of a new Minsk process. Lavrov's answer was blunt. He confirmed that Moscow has seen a 28-point draft plan based on understandings reached at the Anchorage summit in August 2025 between U.S. and Russian officials. Those understandings largely codified what had already been achieved in Istanbul, a neutral, non-NATO Ukraine with limits on its armed forces, withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donbass, and de facto acceptance that Donbass and Crimea are Russian. In return, Russia would accept certain transitional arrangements in regions like Zaporozhye and Kherson and agree to restrictions such as a ban on NATO troops in Ukraine. Crucially, Lavrov stressed that Russia has never received an official version of the U.S. plan. The document Moscow possesses came through unofficial channels. It may not be identical to the version leaked to the media. There are elements that the Russians consider potentially workable. For example, the notion of Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass, de facto recognition of Russian control over Donbass and Crimea, and the explicit exclusion of NATO forces from Ukrainian territory. But even in the 28-point version, there are serious problems. The clause banning NATO troops in Ukraine, for example, does not clearly forbid European forces that could deploy under a national or EU flag rather than a NATO flag. That is a loophole no Russian government will tolerate. There are also provisions regarding Russia's frozen assets that are simply unacceptable in their current form. Lavrov's message was clear. If the final plan reflects the letter and spirit of Anchorage, essentially Istanbul Plus, then Moscow is prepared to talk. If, however, Washington and its allies strip out the essential understandings reached with Russia and replace them with vague promises and Western wish lists, then the plan is a non-starter. And as of now, Moscow has not been given any official updated text, including the allegedly revised 19-point version that emerged from Geneva. Meanwhile, a new American player has entered the scene, Dan Driscoll, Trump's designated peace envoy, replacing General Kellogg. Driscoll still holds a Pentagon post and reportedly has a long-standing personal relationship with Vice President J.D. Vance. Unlike Kellogg, who spent his time shuttling to Kiev, parroting Ukrainian talking points, and never once establishing a serious channel to Moscow, Driscoll has at least tried to engage the Russians directly. In Kiev, he reportedly told European officials and Ukrainian representatives what they did not want to hear. Ukraine is losing the war, and nothing the West does now will reverse that. The 28-point plan, he warned, may be Ukraine's last chance to salvage something. The Europeans were outraged. One participant described the meeting as repugnant, but what angered them was the intrusion of reality into a bubble of self-delusion. Driscoll then did what a genuine peace envoy is supposed to do. He reached out to the other side. He learned that Ukrainian military intelligence chief Kyrilo Budanov was holding secret talks with Russian military intelligence in Abu Dhabi. These meetings have been going on for some time as a back channel, handling delicate issues such as prisoner exchanges and almost certainly broader discussions of the war's course and political conditions in both countries. Russian presidential advisor Yuri Ushakov has now publicly confirmed the existence of this channel. Seeing an opportunity, Driscoll flew to Abu Dhabi and effectively gate-crashed this secret meeting in order to establish a private line to the Russians. From Moscow's perspective, there was nothing inherently wrong with that. Ushakov describes how American, Ukrainian, and Russian intelligence representatives all found themselves in the same bushes, as he put it, in Abu Dhabi. On the Russian side, the officials present were not political figures, but senior officers responsible for practical issues, very likely someone at the level of Admiral Igor Kostyukov, head of Russian military intelligence, the GRU. These officers were there to pursue fragile technical understandings, prisoner swaps, humanitarian arrangements, and other sensitive matters, not to negotiate a grand political settlement. As Ushakov has pointed out, they told Driscoll politely but firmly that they were not empowered to discuss the peace plan. They had seen an unofficial version and knew it required serious analysis and discussion in Moscow, but that discussion had not yet taken place. If Driscoll wanted to talk about the plan, he would need to do so with higher-level political and security officials. What came next infuriated Moscow. Someone in Washington leaked the very existence of the Abu Dhabi meeting, leaked not only that Driscoll had met Russian intelligence officers there, but that Budanov had been conducting a secret back channel with the Russians. That leak did not originate in Moscow. It did not come from the Russians, or almost certainly from Budanov, who has every reason to keep his back channel secret if he wants to stay alive. It came from inside the U.S. system, from people who had access to highly sensitive information and chose to use it to sabotage diplomacy. By exposing Budanov's role, they have not only damaged a crucial channel of communication, they may have placed his life in danger. Budanov has already survived multiple assassination attempts. In Kiev, he is under constant political attack from Zelensky's powerful chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, who has been trying to get him dismissed. Budanov's offense, from the perspective of the Kiev hardliners, is that he occasionally tells the truth. He warned months ago that if there was no ceasefire by midsummer, Ukraine's position would deteriorate sharply. He has spoken about the war as a losing proposition. It is entirely plausible that his private talks with the Russians, where he can get a more realistic picture of the military balance, have reinforced his sense that the war cannot be won. Now, thanks to the leaks, everyone in Ukraine knows he has been speaking to the Russians behind closed doors. For men like Yermak and other ultra-hawks in Kiev, this is ammunition to brand him a traitor and push again for his removal. For more violent actors, it may be a pretext to try to kill him. Whoever leaked the Abu Dhabi meeting has knowingly increased the risk of internal purges and political violence in Kiev just to derail the negotiation process. The Abu Dhabi leak is part of a broader pattern. In recent days, transcripts of alleged conversations between Ushakov and key intermediaries have also appeared in Western media. One transcript reportedly shows Kirill Dmitriev acknowledging that he leaked the original Trump peace plan to Axios and the Financial Times. Dmitriev says the transcript is fake, and his denial is credible. My own assessment has long been that someone like Kellogg, who opposed the plan's Russo-American framework, was far more likely to be the original leaker. Another purported transcript describes a call between Ushakov and Steve Witkoff, Trump's earlier designated interlocutor, in which Witkoff supposedly asks what Trump should say to flatter Putin and how best to present the Gaza ceasefire as a success. Again, Moscow refuses to confirm the authenticity of these transcripts and condemns the leaks as a gross violation of confidentiality. Whether every word in these transcripts is true or fabricated is, in some respects, beside the point. The simple fact that such calls are being taped and selectively leaked reveals something essential about the internal struggle in Washington. Conversations between the president's designated representative and a senior advisor to the Russian president are not casual chat. They are inherently sensitive. If they are recorded as part of intelligence collection, they are classified. If they are recorded as part of diplomatic protocol, they are classified. Either way, leaking them is almost certainly a criminal act. Yet someone with access to this material is dripping it into the media to portray Russia as manipulating the process and to paint figures like Witkoff as dupes or stooges. It is the same playbook we saw in 2017, when hostile elements in the U.S., permanent government, used leaks to cripple Trump's first administration with accusations of Russian collusion. The target now is not just Trump, but the very notion of a negotiated settlement with Moscow. This campaign of sabotage is not confined to Washington. In Europe, figures like Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, and others have also waded in with statements clearly designed to discredit any peace plan that acknowledges Russian gains. Macron has publicly called Trump's plan unacceptable because it supposedly constitutes a surrender to Russia. At the same time, he continues to float the idea of sending coalitions of the willing to fight in Ukraine under national or EU flags rather than NATO's, as if relabeling Western troops would somehow make them acceptable to Moscow. His recent remarks about Russia that it has become a state that no longer builds hospitals or schools but only churns out submarines and bombers are so detached from reality that they are almost beyond parody. Even in France, he is being ridiculed by some for these outbursts, yet he presses on, insisting that Europe must stand firm even as its own economies wobble. Western media reinforce these illusions. Commentators like Ambrose Evans Pritchard in the Daily Telegraph have descended into outright fantasy, talking about Russia being on the verge of collapse, denied buyers for its oil, while Ukraine supposedly stands on the brink of some miraculous reversal. One phrase used to describe Trump's plan is snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, as if Moscow, not Kyiv, is the side facing military exhaustion and demographic crisis. The reality is precisely the opposite. Beijing has just hosted the China-Russia Energy Business Forum, with Xi Jinping sending a warm message praising the depth and stability of the bilateral energy partnership, promising to deepen cooperation and help stabilize global supply chains. China is by far Russia's largest oil customer, and India is another major buyer. These are not minor players who can be browbeaten into joining Western sanctions. The idea that nobody wants to buy Russian oil is a comforting fairy tale for Western elites, not a description of the real world. Behind all of this noise lies the stubborn fact that the military situation dictates the diplomatic one, not the other way around. On the ground, Russian forces are accelerating their offensive. They are pushing through key towns such as Pokrovsk and pressing hard around the Mirnograd area, where Ukrainian troops are increasingly encircled. Moscow's defense ministry has begun publishing detailed reports on these operations, which usually precedes formal announcements of major victories. Leaflet campaigns are underway, urging Ukrainian troops trapped in pockets like Mirnograd to surrender. There are unsubstantiated Ukrainian claims of successful counterattacks in some sectors, but these are not backed by serious visual evidence. And even some Ukrainian sources admit that their high command has effectively given up on certain battles and is redeploying troops to other threatened fronts. One doesn't have to believe every Russian claim or dismiss every Ukrainian statement to see the pattern. Kyiv is fighting a defensive war with an eroding army, declining firepower, and an exhausted population. Moscow is fighting a war of attrition in which it holds the initiative, has deeper reserves, and can afford to be patient. The longer the war drags on, the worse Ukraine's position becomes. Yet in Brussels, Washington, and Kyiv, many of the same people who pushed Ukraine into this confrontation still cling to the comforting illusion that Russia is one sanctions package away from collapse, that somehow the front will stabilize, and that a beaten Russian state will be forced to accept Western terms. It is delusion, pure and simple. The Trump administration's approach to diplomacy has not helped. Rather than building a disciplined negotiating team with a single coherent chain of command and regular plenary sessions, Washington has lurched from one improvisation to another. First Kellogg, then Witkoff, now Driscoll and Jared Kushner, each with their own channels and agendas. At one point, the United States effectively had two peace envoys who were working at cross purposes, one echoing Kyiv's maximalist demands, the other trying to talk to Moscow. Serious diplomacy between great powers is not conducted via surprise appearances in Abu Dhabi hotel lobbies, Twitter leaks, and anonymous sources whispering about 28-point or 19-point drafts. During the Cold War, U.S. and Soviet officials sat down across a table in an orderly process and hammered out agreements line by line. Today, that institutional memory seems to have been lost inside the U.S. bureaucracy, and the permanent government appears hostile to any negotiation at all. Yet, despite the chaos, there is still a narrow opening. Washington plans to send Witkoff, Kushner, and Driscoll to Moscow, Putin has a packed schedule, summits in Central Asia, a major visit to India with a large delegation and likely significant agreements, his annual marathon Q&A with the Russian public, and preparations for his State of the Union address. Fitting in a serious meeting with U.S. representatives will not be easy, and the Russians are not going to drop everything for a delegation that might arrive with a shredded, watered-down version of the Anchorage understandings. Even so, Moscow has signaled that if the United States is prepared to negotiate on the basis of reality, meaning acceptance of Russian control over Donbass and Crimea, a neutral Ukraine with capped forces, and a clear halt to NATO's eastward march, it will talk. The real question is whether Washington, Kyiv, and key European capitals can face reality. For reasons that defy logic, elites in these capitals seem more afraid of being seen to give in to Russia than they are of seeing Ukraine destroyed outright. They have spent years telling their publics that Russia is on the brink of collapse, that sanctions are crushing Moscow, that Putin is isolated, and that total Ukrainian victory is just one more arms package away. Admitting now that these narratives were false would be politically costly. So they cling to illusions and demonize anyone who suggests a negotiated end to the war, even when that war is clearly unwinnable on the terms they themselves proclaimed. In the meantime, the rest of the world is moving on. Russia is deepening its partnerships with China, India, and the broader global south. Energy flows are being rerouted away from Europe. The sanctions regime is eroding. BRICS-style economic and financial structures are slowly displacing Western institutions. The people in Washington and Brussels who still imagine that they can dictate terms to Moscow from a position of strength are living in a world that no longer exists. The hard truth is this: the military balance in Ukraine favors Russia and is likely to do so even more in the months ahead. The longer the war continues, the higher the price Ukraine will pay in lives, infrastructure, and territory. A realistic peace plan anchored in the understandings reached at Istanbul and Anchorage and reflecting the actual state of the battlefield would not be a surrender to Russia. It would be an overdue recognition of reality and the least bad option left for Ukraine. Those who sabotage such a plan, whether through leaks, political grandstanding, or fantasies of European troops in Ukraine, are not saving Ukraine. They are driving it toward ruin.